On a bustling Saturday afternoon at Sapphire Plaza, the air was filled with laughter, chatter, and the hum of weekend shoppers. Families strolled through the aisles, teenagers wandered with friends, and solo customers enjoyed the lively atmosphere. Among the crowd was David Carter, a successful real estate investor in his late 40s. Dressed casually in jeans, a t-shirt, and a red cap emblazoned with "Build America," David was not there for leisure. As the new owner of Sapphire Plaza, he had come to observe its operations firsthand, preferring a low-profile visit to get an authentic view of his property. David's hat, however, did not go unnoticed. A few shoppers cast lingering glances his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Yet, David remained unfazed. He continued walking, quietly appreciating the lively environment and making mental notes about the mall's strengths and weaknesses. Not far away, Amanda Reed, a sharp-eyed and opinionated shopper, spotted him. The sight of the red cap stopped her in her tracks. To Amanda, the cap was more than just an accessory. It was a symbol of division and beliefs she strongly opposed. Her irritation bubbled over as she fixated on David's calm demeanor. Without hesitation, Amanda marched toward the security desk, where Alex Stone, a young, easygoing officer, stood. "Excuse me," Amanda said, her voice laced with urgency. "That man over there, his hat is offensive. It's making people uncomfortable. You need to do something about it." Alex followed her pointed finger to David, who was browsing calmly at a nearby kiosk. He turned back to Amanda, his face a mask of professionalism. "Ma'am, I don't think wearing a hat is against mall policy," he said carefully, hoping to de-escalate the situation. Amanda crossed her arms, her voice rising in frustration. "It's not just a hat. It's a political statement. It's people like him who stir up trouble, and I won't tolerate it here. If you don't act, I'll make sure someone else does." Caught between her insistence and his duty to maintain order, Alex reluctantly approached David. "Excuse me, sir," he began with a polite tone. "We've had a complaint about your hat. I'll have to ask you to remove it or leave the premises." David turned to face Alex, his expression calm but firm. "A complaint? About my hat? It's just a hat. Am I breaking a rule I'm unaware of?" Alex hesitated. "Not exactly, sir, but some patrons feel uncomfortable," he replied, his discomfort evident. David raised an eyebrow. "Then I'd like to see the policy that justifies this request. If there isn't one, I don't see why I should leave." The situation escalated further when Sophia Lane, the mall manager, arrived. Known for her no-nonsense approach, Sophia listened as Amanda recounted her complaint. Turning to David, she said sharply, "Sir, we've had multiple complaints. We aim to keep this mall a welcoming space for everyone. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." David met her gaze, his tone calm but resolute. "I've done nothing wrong. If you're determined to remove me, you're making a mistake, one you'll regret." Sophia's lips tightened. "I'm not here to argue. Alex, escort him out." David nodded slightly, his composure unshaken. As he left with Alex, he glanced back at Sophia and said, "Remember my words. This isn't over." The next morning, an urgent email summoned Sophia and her team to a meeting with Jacob Stern, the regional director. The room was tense as Jacob began. "Yesterday, a serious incident occurred. A man was removed from this mall without cause, treated with blatant disrespect. That man is David Carter, the new owner of Sapphire Plaza." A stunned silence filled the room. Sophia's face paled, and Alex and his fellow officer exchanged uneasy glances. Jacob continued, his tone sharp. "Mr. Carter personally contacted me, and I am deeply disappointed by what I've heard. Your actions reflect poorly on this mall and our company. Sophia, as manager, you bear the greatest responsibility. Effective immediately, you are terminated." Sophia's protests died in her throat as the weight of Jacob's words settled over her. Alex and his colleague were spared termination, but were ordered to undergo extensive training on professionalism and bias mitigation. Meanwhile, David was already working to transform Sapphire Plaza. He introduced mandatory staff training programs, implemented a customer respect policy, and made it clear that personal biases had no place in his malls. Signs were installed at every entrance declaring, "At Sapphire Plaza, we respect all customers. We are committed to providing a welcoming environment for everyone." A month later, David returned to Sapphire Plaza. This time, the atmosphere felt different. Staff were more engaged, their demeanor warmer and more professional. Alex greeted David with a polite nod, a marked change from their earlier encounter. As David walked through the mall, Amanda spotted him from afar. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she quickly turned away, avoiding any interaction. David noticed but chose not to react. He had no interest in gloating. His focus was on the progress being made. Meeting with Rachel, the new interim manager, David listened to her enthusiastic plans for the mall's future. "I'm grateful for this opportunity, Mr. Carter," Rachel said. "We've come a long way, and I believe we can continue to make this a place where everyone feels welcome." David smiled. "I'm confident in you, Rachel. Let's make this mall a model of respect and professionalism." As he left the mall that day, David felt a sense of closure. The incident had been a wake-up call for everyone involved, and the changes were already bearing fruit. While there was still work to be done, Sapphire Plaza was finally becoming the inclusive, welcoming space he had envisioned, a testament to the power of fairness, leadership, and accountability. As David strolled through the mall, the echoes of his earlier visit lingered in his mind. Each step brought a subtle reminder of the tension, the missteps, and the lessons yet to be fully embraced. Yet now, with every passing moment, the changes felt more tangible. The air carried a calmness that hadn't existed before. Staff moved with purpose, their interactions with customers more intentional and inviting. He paused by a kiosk where a group of teenagers was laughing, their energy infectious. Nearby, Alex was guiding an elderly woman to an escalator, his tone kind and attentive. David's thoughts were interrupted as Rachel approached him, clipboard in hand but a smile lighting her face. "Mr. Carter," she greeted warmly, "I wanted to mention a few things we're working on based on the feedback from your last visit." She gestured toward the food court. "We've added signs with the new policy near seating areas. Some of the staff have suggested even incorporating it into training videos for new hires." David nodded thoughtfully. "Good thinking, Rachel. It's small steps like this that set the foundation. Consistency matters." As they walked, the subdued murmur of polite conversations replaced the uneasy buzz he had once experienced. He noticed Amanda again, standing near a clothing store. Her back was to him, but there was a noticeable stiffness in her posture. A part of David expected her to turn around, maybe even offer an apology. She didn't. Instead, she busied herself with adjusting a scarf on display, her hands moving too quickly to appear casual. Rachel noticed where his attention lingered and tilted her head slightly. "Do you think she's learned anything?" David's gaze softened. "Sometimes, people need time to face their reflection in the mirror. The real question isn't if she's learned anything. It's whether we've created a space where she can learn." Rachel's brows furrowed in thought, but before she could respond, a customer near the bookstore called out, waving for her attention. She excused herself and moved quickly to assist. David turned his focus back to the bookstore. It had been one of the quieter sections during his last visit, but now, a group of young parents gathered by the entrance, flipping through children's books, while their toddlers explored a play corner. It was a small scene, yet it captured exactly what he wanted for the mall, a sense of ease, where people from all walks of life could coexist without friction. David stood there for a moment longer, watching a father kneel to tie his son's shoelace while holding a picture book in one hand. A genuine smile crossed David's face. He didn't need any grand gestures or overt apologies to see the shift. It was in these little things, the quiet moments, the softened expressions, the unspoken understanding between people who might not always agree but could still share a space. "Mr. Carter," Alex's voice interrupted his thoughts. David turned to find the young security officer standing nearby, looking somewhat hesitant. I wanted to thank you for giving me and Jenny another chance. We've been working on taking a more balanced approach, and honestly, I think we've grown a lot since then." David clasped Alex's shoulder firmly, his expression serious but kind. "Acknowledging growth is just as important as the growth itself. Keep leading by example, Alex. That's how real change happens." Alex nodded, visibly relieved, and stepped away to return to his duties. David turned back toward the bookstore, taking a final glance at the parents and their children. In the faint background noise of the mall, he caught snippets of laughter, casual chatter, and the melodic hum of life moving forward. This wasn't about him, his hat, or even the policies he had implemented. It was about fostering an environment where everyone, whether they agreed with each other or not, could coexist with dignity and mutual respect. The mall didn't just belong to him. It belonged to the people who came here to build memories, share moments, and find common ground in their differences. David felt a small flicker of satisfaction as he continued his walk, knowing that the work wasn't done, but was undeniably moving in the right direction. And that, for now, was enough. As David continued walking, his thoughts lingered on Alex's words. Growth. It was a simple concept, but one that required intentional effort, especially in an environment like this. He approached the center of the mall where the new signage hung prominently, its message clear and direct. "At Sapphire Plaza, we respect all customers. We are committed to providing a welcoming environment for everyone." Several shoppers paused to read the sign, some nodding in approval, others glancing at it briefly before continuing on. It wasn't just a statement, it was a silent commitment from the mall to its patrons. And yet, David knew that words alone wouldn't carry the weight. Actions had to speak louder. Near the sign, a young woman in a uniform nervously adjusted her badge while speaking to an older couple at the information desk. David paused, watching the interaction unfold. She seemed hesitant, fumbling over her words as the couple gestured toward their shopping bags. Finally, the woman gave a small bow of apology and hurried off to fetch what appeared to be a manager. Rachel reappeared beside David, catching sight of the scene. "That's Kara," she said quietly. "She's one of our newest hires. This is her first customer-facing role, and she's been nervous about making a mistake." David crossed his arms, observing as Kara returned, now accompanied by another staff member. This time, her posture was more confident, and she managed a polite smile as she explained something to the couple. The older woman's expression softened, and after a moment, they both nodded in understanding. "Seems like she handled it well," David remarked. "She did," Rachel agreed. "But that didn't happen overnight. Kara's been shadowing some of the more experienced staff and taking feedback seriously. She reminds me of what you said earlier, how we need to create a space where people can grow." David gave a small nod, his eyes still on Kara. "It's not just about creating the space," he said thoughtfully. "It's about making sure the people in it are willing to step into the discomfort of learning. That's the hardest part." As they moved on, David found himself drawn to the food court, where the energy seemed livelier than before. Families gathered around tables, sharing meals and stories, while kids darted between the seating areas and play zones. The once tense atmosphere had shifted into something far more organic, a community in motion. At one table, a group of teenagers sat laughing loudly, their voices carrying over the general buzz of conversation. One of them wore a shirt with a bold statement that might have sparked controversy just a few weeks ago. This time, however, no one seemed to care. The message on the shirt didn't matter as much as the genuine joy on the wearer's face. David turned to Rachel with a quiet smile. "This is what I was hoping for," he said. "Not perfection, but progress. It's in these little moments, the kind most people don't even notice." Rachel followed his gaze, her own smile growing. "You're right," she said. "But it's also in the way people like Alex, Jenny, and even Kara are stepping up. They're setting the tone." Before David could respond, a voice called out from behind them. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter?" He turned to see a middle-aged man approaching, his face a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, extending a hand. "I've been coming to this mall for years, and I noticed the changes right away. I appreciate what you're doing here. It feels different. Better." David shook his hand firmly, a hint of surprise in his expression. "Thank you," he replied. "I'm glad to hear that. It's a team effort, and we're all working to make this place as welcoming as it should be." The man nodded, glancing briefly at the signage nearby before adding, "It's good to know someone cares. Not everyone does these days." With that, he gave a small wave and disappeared into the crowd. David stood still for a moment, absorbing the unexpected exchange. It wasn't often that people took the time to acknowledge positive changes, and the man's words carried more weight than he expected. Rachel, standing beside him, finally broke the silence. "It's working, isn't it?" she asked softly. David's smile returned, faint but genuine. "It's starting to," he said, "but there's still more to do." They walked back toward the mall's center, where the sounds of life continued to unfold in a symphony of voices, footsteps, and laughter. Each sound was a reminder of the potential for connection, the quiet resilience of a community, and the slow but steady work of building trust. David knew this wasn't the end of the story, just another chapter in the ongoing effort to make Sapphire Plaza a place where people of all backgrounds could coexist, learn, and grow. And in the heart of it all, he felt the faint but undeniable pulse of progress. For now, that was enough to keep him moving forward. David's thoughts lingered on the man's words as he continued his stroll through the heart of Sapphire Plaza. The hum of life surrounded him, a constant reminder of the mall's purpose, a gathering place where people could coexist, each bringing their unique stories and differences. The faint sound of a violin pulled his attention toward one corner of the food court. There, near a quieter seating area, a young street performer had set up, her case open on the floor with a few scattered bills and coins inside. The melody she played was hauntingly beautiful, drawing a small crowd of listeners. Children sat cross-legged on the tile floor, mesmerized, while their parents stood nearby, sipping coffee and nodding in appreciation. David stepped closer, intrigued not only by the music, but by the performer herself. She was no older than 18, her eyes closed as she swayed with the music, pouring emotion into every note. A security officer stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. David recognized him. It was Jenny, her demeanor calm but vigilant. As the song ended, the small crowd clapped, and a few people dropped more money into the open case. Jenny approached the performer, speaking softly, her body language relaxed. David caught snippets of the conversation, something about keeping the area clear and making sure her music didn't disrupt nearby shops. The performer nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and nervousness, and Jenny gave her a reassuring smile before stepping back to her post. Rachel, who had rejoined David, observed the interaction. "She's really improved," Rachel said, referring to Jenny. "A few weeks ago, she might have asked that girl to leave just to avoid potential complaints. But now—" David nodded, watching as the performer began another piece, this time a lively tune that made the children giggle and clap along. "She's learning how to balance the rules with the human element. That's what matters." As they moved away, the sound of the violin faded into the background, replaced by the steady murmur of shoppers. They passed a display near the main fountain, where a group of volunteers was setting up a table. A large sign read, "Community Book Exchange. Take a book, leave a book." David stopped, watching as a young boy eagerly approached the table with his father, clutching a worn paperback. The volunteers explained the concept, and the boy's face lit up as he chose a shiny hardcover in return. It was such a simple concept, yet it spoke volumes about the mall's evolving spirit, a place where connections were valued as much as transactions. This was Kara's idea, Rachel said, motioning to the display. She suggested it during one of our team meetings, said it might make the mall feel more human. David's lips curled into a smile. She's right. It's these little things that leave a lasting impression. They continued their walk, weaving through clusters of shoppers and families. The atmosphere remained light, but David couldn't help but notice Amanda again, this time standing near a boutique window. She wasn't shopping. Her arms were crossed, and her gaze occasionally darted around the mall. Rachel followed his line of sight. "She's been here for hours," Rachel said quietly. "Do you think she's looking for something or someone?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Amanda's posture, her stiff movements, the way her shoulders seemed to hold the weight of something unresolved. Finally, he said, "Sometimes people don't know they're looking for resolution until it finds them." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Do you think you should talk to her?" David hesitated. Confronting Amanda wouldn't change the past, and it wasn't his job to force her to see the lessons she might have missed. Still, part of him wondered if she needed to hear something, anything, that could plant a seed of reflection. "No," he said at last. "If she's ready, she'll come to her own conclusions. My role isn't to chase after people. It's to create a space where they can figure things out for themselves." Rachel seemed to mull over his words as they walked on, their steps measured and deliberate. Sapphire Plaza wasn't perfect, not yet, and perhaps it never would be. But in the smiles exchanged between strangers, the laughter of children, and the quiet resolve of staff like Alex and Jenny, David saw the beginnings of something he had always believed in: the power of shared spaces to bridge divides. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, David was content to let the mall speak for itself. Every interaction, every small gesture of kindness, every act of learning and growth became part of its evolving story. And as long as the story continued, David knew he had done his part. David's gaze lingered for a moment longer on Amanda before he turned his attention back to the fountain area. The sound of the water cascading over polished stone provided a soothing backdrop to the quiet buzz of conversations around him. Nearby, a group of teenagers had gathered, their chatter growing animated as they leaned over a table littered with books from the community exchange. One of the boys held up a novel, clearly teasing his friend, who blushed as the group erupted in laughter. Rachel, walking beside David, caught his eye. "It's amazing how quickly something so small can make an impact," she said, gesturing toward the book exchange. David nodded but remained silent. His attention was drawn to one of the teens, a girl who had picked up a dog-eared fantasy novel. Her friends called out to her, but she seemed lost in the book's pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scene reminded David of his own youth, how books had once been his refuge during challenging times. "That's the point, isn't it?" David finally said, breaking the silence. "To create spaces where people feel safe enough to just be themselves." Rachel smiled but didn't respond, letting David's words settle between them. As they continued their walk, the faint notes of the violin once again reached David's ears. The young performer had moved closer to the central concourse, now playing a lively tune that drew small children to dance around her. Jenny, still keeping an eye on the scene, exchanged a quick smile with the parents watching nearby. David approached the performer's case and dropped a bill into it. The girl looked up, startled, then smiled shyly and mouthed, "Thank you." David nodded in return, stepping back to avoid drawing too much attention. Rachel leaned closer, her voice low. "Do you think she knows who you are?" David chuckled. "Doesn't matter if she does. What matters is she feels this is a place where her talent is welcome." They moved on again, this time toward a quieter wing of the mall. Here, the noise of the main concourse gave way to softer sounds, the hum of air conditioning and the distant rustle of clothing racks being rearranged. A small cafe nestled in the corner caught David's eye. Inside, an elderly couple sat at a corner table, their heads bent close as they spoke in hushed tones over steaming mugs of coffee. The scene was unremarkable at first glance, but something about their quiet intimacy struck David. He paused, watching as the man reached across the table to take the woman's hand. They shared a smile, simple, unguarded, and deeply familiar. Moments like that, David said softly, almost to himself. That's why places like this matter. Rachel followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. It's easy to forget that, isn't it? With all the noise, the complaints, the logistics. But in the end, it's about giving people a place to connect. David glanced at her, his face unreadable but calm. That's why it's worth all the effort. Because connection is what makes everything else work. Without it, a mall is just a building with stores. But with it, he trailed off, his eyes returning to the couple. It becomes something more. As they resumed their walk, the atmosphere shifted again, this time growing lighter as they passed a group of children crowding around a balloon artist near a toy store. The artist twisted colorful balloons into intricate shapes, much to the delight of his audience. A boy held up a freshly made sword, pretending to duel with his sister, who giggled and parried with her own balloon shield. Rachel chuckled at the sight. "You're right," she said, her tone warm. "It's in the little things. The violinist, the books, the balloons. They're what make this place feel alive." David gave a small smile, but his thoughts drifted back to Amanda. She was no longer near the boutique window, but he knew she hadn't left. Her presence lingered, like a thread waiting to be woven into the fabric of the day. "She's still here," Rachel said suddenly, as if reading his mind. David glanced at her, his expression measured. "I know, and she will be until she's ready to leave, or ready to confront whatever brought her here in the first place." Rachel hesitated. "Do you think she's holding on to the past?" "Maybe," David said, his tone even. "But that's her choice. All we can do is create a space where she can decide what to do with it." Rachel seemed to consider this as they turned another corner, the sounds of the mall shifting once more. David felt the rhythm of the place, its people, its energy, its quiet moments of growth and connection. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were part of something larger than himself. For now, that was enough. David's steps slowed as he reached the edge of the quieter wing of the mall. His eyes fell on the polished floor, reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights, and for a moment, he let the subtle hum of the mall envelop him. Rachel had paused beside him, flipping through a set of notes on her tablet, but David's attention drifted to a small commotion near the entrance of a nearby store. A boy, no older than 6, clung to the hand of an older woman, likely his grandmother, his wide eyes staring longingly at the storefront display of colorful action figures. The woman crouched down, speaking softly to him, but he kept shaking his head, his grip tightening on her hand. David watched as another figure approached, a young woman in the store's uniform, her movements deliberate but kind. She knelt beside the boy and began speaking in a low voice. Though David couldn't hear her words, her expression said enough. Patience, understanding, and unspoken empathy. The boy relaxed slightly, his shoulders loosening as he responded with a small nod. The employee rose to her feet, offering the grandmother a reassuring smile before leading them both into the store. Rachel noticed David's lingering gaze. "That's Emily," she said, tilting her head toward the store. "She started as a part-timer a year ago. She's been really good with customers, especially kids. The manager's already talking about promoting her." David smiled faintly. "She's got a good presence. That kind of connection can't be taught. It has to be encouraged." Rachel tapped her tablet thoughtfully. "Do you think there's a way we can highlight moments like this? Not just as part of training, but as reminders of why we're here?" David glanced at her. "A culture isn't built on rules alone. It's built on stories. People remember stories like hers far longer than policies. Rachel looked at him, her expression brightening. Maybe we could create a recognition program. Spotlight employees who go above and beyond, like Emily. It'd give others something to aspire to. David nodded slowly, his gaze still on the store's entrance. Make it about values, not just performance. Show people what it means to be part of this community. As they resumed their walk, the mall seemed to shift around them, the ebb and flow of life continuing in its unspoken rhythm. A sudden burst of laughter drew their attention back to the central concourse, where the balloon artist was now juggling 3 colorful shapes to the delight of his audience. Nearby, Jenny was speaking to a group of parents, her hands gesturing animatedly as she explained something about the upcoming family events the mall had planned. Her stance was relaxed but professional, her expression bright. It was a far cry from the nervous uncertainty she had displayed not so long ago. "She's finding her stride," Rachel said with a note of pride. "I think the training really opened her eyes to what she's capable of." David smiled, watching Jenny interact with the group. Sometimes all it takes is showing people they're capable of more than they think. Confidence grows in steps, not leaps. Their path eventually brought them back toward the main fountain, where the community book exchange continued to draw visitors. A man in his 30s was browsing the selection with his daughter, her small hands eagerly flipping through the pages of a picture book. "Daddy, can I take this one?" the girl asked, holding up a book with colorful illustrations. The man smiled, crouching down beside her. "Sure, sweetheart. But remember, we have to leave one for someone else, okay?" The girl nodded earnestly, digging into her small backpack and pulling out a well-worn book of her own to leave behind. David watched as they completed the exchange, the father taking a moment to thank the volunteers before guiding his daughter toward the escalators. Rachel turned to David, her voice quiet but firm. "This is what makes it all worth it, isn't it?" David didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the scene, the violinist packing up her instrument, the families at the fountain, the steady flow of shoppers weaving through the space. There was no singular moment that defined what Sapphire Plaza had become. It was a collection of these small, fleeting interactions, each contributing to the larger tapestry of connection and community. He finally spoke, his voice measured. "It's not perfect, and it never will be, but it's alive, and that's all it needs to be." Rachel's smile widened as she tucked her tablet under her arm. "Then we're on the right path." David nodded, his steps resuming their steady rhythm as the mall's life unfolded around him, moment by moment. As David moved past the fountain area, the sound of the water became a comforting background melody. He caught sight of a small cafe tucked into a corner, its warm lighting contrasting with the open brightness of the mall. A pair of employees stood near the counter, chatting quietly as they refilled the display case with fresh pastries. A few tables away, a man sat alone with a cup of coffee, a laptop open in front of him. His focus seemed split between his work and the people passing by. Occasionally, his gaze would linger on a particular person or group, his expression softening as though observing moments that resonated with him. Rachel followed David's gaze. "He's been here a lot lately," she remarked. "One of the baristas told me he's writing something. A book, I think. He said the energy here inspires him." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "The mall inspires him?" Rachel shrugged with a faint smile. "Seems like it. I guess it's not just about shopping. Sometimes people come here for something else." David let the thought settle as they continued toward the main promenade. The distant sound of the violinist's music had faded entirely now, replaced by the low hum of conversations and footsteps. Near the escalators, he spotted Alex speaking with an older woman. She appeared flustered, gesturing toward her handbag while Alex listened intently. "Something wrong?" Rachel asked, noticing his attention shift. "Not wrong," David said. "Alex is just doing what he's supposed to do, listening." As they watched, Alex reached into his pocket and handed the woman a small card. She nodded gratefully before giving him a pat on the arm and heading toward the customer service desk. Alex turned, his expression calm but focused, and caught sight of David. There was a moment of hesitation, as if Alex wasn't sure whether to approach, but then he gave a small nod and resumed his post. Rachel smiled. "He's changed too, hasn't he?" "Everyone has," David replied, his voice steady. "It's not just about policies or training. People rise, or fall, to the expectations you set for them. And Alex is rising." They continued their walk, passing a small cluster of kiosks where a group of teenagers gathered, laughing over their phones and occasionally glancing at the merchandise. A woman running one of the kiosks leaned slightly over her counter, her expression amused, as she kept a watchful eye on them. "Think she's worried about them?" Rachel asked. "Probably not," David said, watching the scene. "She knows they're just kids being kids. That's part of what makes this place feel alive." Rachel seemed to consider this as they reached the main atrium, where the sound of children laughing echoed faintly. A makeshift art exhibit had been set up nearby, featuring colorful drawings and paintings created by local school students. Each piece was displayed with a small card showing the artist's name and age. David slowed, his attention drawn to one particular painting, a vivid depiction of a sunset over a park, the colors blending in a way that seemed almost too mature for the artist's listed age, 8 years old. "Impressive, isn't it?" Rachel said, stepping beside him. "It is," David said softly, his eyes lingering on the painting. "Talent like this deserves to be seen." Rachel gestured toward the exhibit. This was Jenny's idea. She thought it would be a good way to connect the mall to the community. David's expression shifted slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Jenny's been surprising me a lot lately." Rachel laughed. "She's surprising herself, I think. But that's what happens when you give people room to grow." They moved on, their steps taking them past another series of shops and kiosks. The buzz of activity surrounded them, but David's thoughts remained focused on the quiet changes he had witnessed throughout the day. It wasn't just the staff or the policies that had shifted. It was the energy of the mall itself, a subtle but palpable transformation that came from countless small actions adding up to something greater. As they approached the entrance to the management office, Rachel stopped and turned to David. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked suddenly. David met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Enough for what?" "For what you want this place to be," Rachel said. "Do you think it's really becoming the kind of space you imagined?" David glanced back toward the concourse, where the sounds of laughter, conversation, and life intertwined. His voice was quiet, but firm when he replied. "It's not about what I imagine. It's about what they make it. All we can do is create the framework. The rest, that's up to them." Rachel nodded slowly, as if letting his words sink in. Together, they stepped through the doors to the management office, leaving the vibrant hum of the mall behind, but carrying its essence with them. For David, the journey wasn't about finding an ending. It was about nurturing something that could keep growing, moment by moment, step by step. And for now, that was more than enough. As David and Rachel entered the management office, the door closed softly behind them, muffling the ambient sounds of the mall. The room was quiet, almost too still compared to the life outside. Rachel moved toward a table near the center, where a set of reports and folders awaited their review. Yet David lingered by the door, his hand brushing against the frame as he glanced back toward the bustling concourse. "Everything all right?" Rachel asked, noticing his pause. David gave a faint nod, stepping further into the room but not sitting. Instead, he crossed to the window that overlooked the atrium. From here, the view was expansive, giving him a bird's-eye perspective of the mall below. The laughter of children at the fountain, the casual movements of shoppers weaving in and out of stores, the employees standing at attention or helping customers, it all unfolded like a living mosaic. "It's strange," he said quietly, his back still to Rachel. "When I first walked in here, it felt heavy, like every part of this place was weighed down by something I couldn't quite name. But now, His voice trailed off as he watched a woman help her toddler tie his shoe by the book exchange. Now it feels lighter, like it's breathing again. Rachel approached, her arms crossed loosely over her tablet. "You think it's the people?" she asked. David turned, leaning back against the window ledge. "Not just the people," he replied. "It's the trust. When trust is broken, it's like a crack in a foundation. Everything around it starts to weaken. But when you rebuild it, even a little, you can feel the difference. That's what's happening here." Rachel set her tablet down, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. I've seen it too. The staff, Alex, Jenny, Kara, they're starting to trust themselves. The customers even. They're not as guarded as they were before." David gave a small smile. "That's because trust is contagious. When one person starts believing in it, others follow. But it's fragile. You can't force it, and you can't fake it. It has to come naturally." Rachel tilted her head slightly, a question forming in her eyes. "Do you think Amanda understands that?" David's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. He considered her question for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the far corner of the room, as though he could see beyond the walls. "I don't know," he admitted. "But understanding isn't always immediate. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes more than we'd like." Rachel hesitated before continuing, her voice quieter now. "Do you think she'll come back? Not just to the mall, but to, acknowledge everything?" David straightened slightly, his posture steady. "It's not about whether she comes back to me or not," he said. "It's about whether she comes back to herself. Whatever she's wrestling with, it's not mine to fix. All I can do is keep this place open for her, for anyone, when they're ready." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Rachel nodded, her respect for David's perspective evident in her thoughtful expression. She reached for one of the reports on the table, flipping it open. "Speaking of keeping this place open," she said, her tone shifting just enough to lighten the moment. "We've got the initial feedback from the new policies. It's mostly positive, but there are a few areas we could improve on." David stepped forward, taking the folder she handed him. His eyes scanned the pages, though his focus remained partly on the lingering energy of the conversation. "Improvements are good," he said. "It means we're paying attention." Rachel smiled. "I figured you'd say that." Before they could delve further into the reports, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. Alex stepped inside, his expression hesitant but calm. "Sorry to bother you," Alex began, glancing between David and Rachel. "But there's someone at the front desk asking to speak with you, Mr. Carter." David arched an eyebrow. "Who is it?" Alex shifted slightly. "She didn't say her name, just, she said you'd know her when you saw her." Rachel and David exchanged a quick glance, but David's expression didn't waver. He closed the folder, set it down on the table, and nodded. "I'll handle it." As he followed Alex back out into the mall, the familiar hum of life returned, though it seemed to carry a sharper edge now. Each step toward the front desk felt deliberate, his mind running through possibilities. When the desk came into view, so did the figure standing there, Amanda. She turned at the sound of his approach, her expression a careful mask that only partially hid the uncertainty in her eyes. David stopped a few steps away, meeting her gaze evenly. "Hello, Amanda," he said simply. She hesitated, her arms crossing loosely, as though shielding herself from something unseen. "David," she replied, her voice quieter than he remembered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The mall seemed to fade into the background, its energy still present but muted, giving space to the charged silence between them. Finally, Amanda broke the stillness. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steadying slightly, "about that day, about what happened, and about what I did." David didn't interrupt. He waited, his posture calm but open, allowing her to find her words. "I was wrong," she admitted, the words falling like stones into the quiet. "I judged you without knowing you. I let my own anger, my own assumptions, Get in the way. She paused, her gaze faltering. I wanted to say that I'm sorry. David let her words hang in the air before responding. Thank you for saying that, he said. It takes courage to face something like this. Amanda looked up, her eyes searching his face for any sign of judgment. But all she found was understanding. I've been coming here, she continued, her tone softer now. Not just to shop, but to feel what's changed. And it has changed. You've done something here, David. Something good. David nodded, his voice steady. It wasn't just me. It never is. This place, these people, they're the ones who make it what it is. Amanda gave a small, tentative smile. Still, you've made it better, and I think that matters more than you realize. As the moment passed, the energy of the mall seemed to return in full, surrounding them like an unspoken promise of possibility. David extended a hand. Amanda hesitated, then took it, the tension between them easing into something closer to resolution. For David, it wasn't about the apology or the acknowledgement. It was about the shift, the quiet proof that even the hardest barriers could begin to crack with time, trust, and understanding. And in that, he found what he'd been looking for all along.